G'day, welcome to netGAZZETTE.com. My name's Michael Mayo, I'm your host. And I'm pleased to bring you our latest production. Now, whilst a lot of what follows is in relation to the Port Arthur massacre, we are not concerned with Martin Bryant's involvement in the events of that day. Rather, we wish to draw everyone's attention, you guys, to the lack of due process, which has become, we believe, the hallmark of that tragic set of events. The evidence available, and there isn't much, due to the utter failure of all those involved in the initial investigation, has in large part been altered, obfuscated, or redacted to a point where it no longer serves as useful evidence. A guilty plea was coerced from a citizen without proper counsel, and this is the linchpin, if you will, that denied the ability for due process to take place. A trial was not required, and by extension a coronial inquiry cannot be convened if the accused plead guilty. Thus, there was an organised and coordinated approach to getting Martin Bryant to plead guilty, and in so doing throw all his rights right out the window, and we believe jeopardise the rights of all those to face a court in future. We believe that irrespective of Bryant's guilt or innocence, the Australian Constitution, and by extension the entire judicial process, became the real victim that day. Left unresolved, these events serve only to embolden the elite and erode the Australian way of life and the idea of a fair go for all. It's what this country was built on, guys and girls. Further, it fosters an above-the-law mentality in our ruling class, which left unchecked will result in more and more freedoms being taken from us, up to the point where there is little to distinguish our country from that of the Americans or others that I could name. We need to have a really good think. Is that really where we want to be going? Is that really what we want? Okay, enough from me. Thanks for joining the channel, by the way, everybody. Hope you subscribe. Hope you stay in touch with us. Hope you provide some comments and some feedback. You can chase us down on all the social media platforms: Twitter, Google+, Facebook, obviously YouTube. You can view all of our videos and other documents and bits and pieces on our website, www.netgazette.com. I guess the best place to keep in contact with us is the website. Second to that would be Google+. Whilst we do publish a good deal of our material to YouTube, we won't be publishing all of it to YouTube. So make sure you check out the site. Alrighty, let's run with the presentation on Port Arthur. It's been quite an effort to put it together. There's a lot of information here. It's a 2 to 3 hour presentation. I've left it in one part so that it can be watched over the course of an evening, or you can break it up yourselves into a few sit downs. Alright, so we'll go with the presentation just to refresh everyone's memory of that day, and then we'll highlight the events that we believe caused a miscarriage of justice to follow a tragic set of events, which has led our nation down a very slippery slope. Alrighty, here we go.
But he just happens to be Carleen Bryant's son, and the burden of that has been devastating for her. Carleen Bryant is tormented by the same questions that trouble us all. What made a seemingly ordinary, if dim-witted young man go out and kill 35 people? And have we learned anything from that dreadful day? Today, Martin Bryant lives here, inside the walls of Risdon Prison on the outskirts of Hobart. He is serving 35 life sentences, 1,035 years without parole, cast into outer darkness and banished from society forever. His only visitor is his mother, Carleen. Martin is in jail. He will never be free, will he?
No.
Who will visit him when you're no longer around?
Probably nobody. I'm the only person who visits at the moment.
What's his physical condition today?
He's overweight.
He's a man into
Too
his
much
40s.
overweight, mainly from through the medication, which puts weight on, and also lack of exercise.
And his psychological condition, his mental state, what's he like?
That's confidential. Even if I knew, I couldn't talk about it. All I can say is that Martin was diagnosed about 3 years ago as having Asperger's syndrome. And he's happy where he is at the moment.
Carleen Bryant is difficult to interview. A softly spoken woman who has arguably been as damaged by the events of that day as many of the survivors.
I felt at the time that because I'm Martin's mother, I was being held accountable in some way for all these crimes.
People up here.
It was a killing rampage that ranks among the deadliest of the 20th century.
Anyway, there, don't go in the shop. He was in the shop. Upstairs. Don't stay here, Caroline.
On the 28th of April 1996, Martin Bryant walked into the Broad Arrow Cafe at the historic Port Arthur site and opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle.
Yeah, Roger, there's been 3 more shots fired.
Bryant was arrested at the scene, and shortly after, he confessed. At the time, Carleen Bryant and her son's lawyer encouraged him to plead guilty to alleviate enormous amounts of public pain. But in her recently published book, she now claims, beyond belief, that her son isn't guilty and the evidence against him was never tested at a trial. But are you really saying that you think if he'd had a trial, although you convinced him to plead guilty, he might have got off?
Well, yes.
Is that
because Martin always, when he was questioned, probably for weeks before I saw him again, he always said he was never in Port Arthur at Broad Arrow.
And you believed him?
Yes. There's no evidence that Martin was there.
But none of that was needed because Martin said in court, yes, I did it. And you went along with it.
Exactly.
And now you wish you hadn't.
Of course, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. A lot of people on that day came forward after, and people who knew Martin had known Martin for years. And they said, as far as they were concerned, they didn't recognise the gunman as being Martin Bryant.
So many people would be very upset to hear you deny that this happened as people understand it happened. What do you say to them?
But there's also a lot of people that realise that Martin didn't have a trial and that there was no evidence proven whether he was the gunman.
But did you ever get the chance to ask him, did you do it, son? Did you ask him that?
I did, but I didn't get any answer.
And then after that, he doesn't want to see you.
No, that's right. Because he's frightened I'm going to ask questions.
Whatever else people say about you, you're a loyal mother.
I am, sure. I know there'll be a lot of people out there that'll be condemning me for even coming on this program, but I want to be able to help Martin.
To have to live with what one's child has done and what has happened to one's child as a result must be a terrible burden. And one has to find, I suppose, some way of surviving.
Paul Mullen can understand a mother's misguided love, but he also knows the truth. As Australia's leading forensic psychiatrist, he was the first to hear Bryant recount the massacre.
One of the odd things about a job like mine is I spend my time talking with people who have done terrible things. What you find are not monsters, but flawed human beings.
You spent how many hours with him?
Quite a lot. And it is very difficult. This was a terrible time in Australia. I think it affected all of us very deeply. But to do my job, you still have to get through that and relate to the human being in front of you, a troubled, intellectually limited, sad, pathetic man who had done something unforgivable.
Will you ever see him again?
I don't think he would want to see me again.
All the people that are dead are in the cafeteria and around the bus. He actually shot people on the bus.
We need to disregard one of the cars came in.
Port Arthur was a black day for the entire nation and a lingering horror for those who were there. I know that you tend not to talk about that dreadful day 15 years ago, but you must think about it a lot, even now.
Oh, well, a day never goes by that you don't think about it.
Vera Jari and Coralie Lever were on holiday together with their husbands at the wrong time and the wrong place. Their men, Ron and Dennis, were ordinary blokes who turned out to be heroes. They died shielding their wives from the hail of bullets.
Dennis thought it was a reenactment, actually, and went to walk away, and that's when Den pushed me to the floor and he started shooting again.
And protected you?
And protected, yeah, very much so, yeah.
And at the same time, your bloke was doing the same thing for you?
We were a little bit of distance away, but the same thing happened there. Yeah. But Dennis didn't move from where he was standing, actually. He was shot there.
Three or four people dead that were covered up near the buses.
He still doesn't communicate a lot, does he? He doesn't talk about the events.
No, he doesn't. He's never talked about them.
Would you like him to?
Yeah, for sure.
But in Martin Bryant's childhood were the signs of what was to come. Despite her denial, his mother's recollections of her young son might, in retrospect, reveal the first fateful steps to Port Arthur.
Because he couldn't entertain himself, we'd often find toys that were broken at a very young age, that was.
What, broken in temper or...?
Yeah, I don't know, whether temper, frustration. Martin was different, I'll put it that way, but as far as abusing people and being nasty, no.
How is it that your view is so different from the one that has been so widely reported?
Well, I mean, I'm his mother. I know what he was like. Yes, he was annoying, like most boys are, especially with their sisters. But as as he got older and Lindy started bringing a few friends home, or they would bring her up, he started turning very nasty towards them.
What form did that take?
He'd just shout at them and tell them not to ring anymore, and abuse them if they came there to the house.
Did you have any sense of foreboding that this kind of behaviour could get worse?
Not until the psychiatrist told us. They said he would never, ever be able to hold a position down, simply because he would aggravate people to such an extent that he'd always be in trouble.
Martin Bryant first came to public notice in 1979 when he was interviewed after an accident with fireworks.
I broke the stick trying to get out, but I couldn't, and it made a hole through my jeans.
Despite a serious injury, he displays the characteristic inappropriate behaviour which was much later diagnosed as Asperger's syndrome.
Do you think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore?
Yes.
Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this?
Yes, but I'm still playing with it.
Fireworks aside, Bryant's was the unnoticed and lonely childhood of an individual unable to make friends, until finally, at 19, he met Helen Harvey, the rich, middle-aged, eccentric heiress to the Tattersalls lottery fortune.
Helen was a very eccentric person. Martin was looking for work at the time. She was battling to work and maintain and keep the cats and the dogs, about 40 cats, fed and cleaned, and about 14 dogs or more.
Were you a bit horrified by this menagerie?
So, yes, sure. She needed some help. So they seemed to click straight away, and they were almost inseparable.
So this was a friendship, a very good friendship, but not a sexual relationship.
No, definitely not. It was like mother and son, because Helen was 52 at the time, and she'd never ever married.
In the chronicle of misfortune that dogged Martin Bryant's early life, Helen Harvey died in a car crash. And then fate struck again when his father, Morris, the only man he could ever talk to, committed suicide.
Well, once again, Martin lost one of his, the last of his close friends.
Not long after Helen.
Not long after Helen. He was absolutely devastated.
Robin, how would Morris have possibly handled what happened a bit later?
Well, I don't believe it would have happened.
But the events that might have triggered the slayings at Port Arthur happened a world away.
Even Martin Bryant is a very dim human being. Knew a lot about the massacre at Dunblane, for example.
Just 6 weeks before Port Arthur, at Dunblane, a small town in the south of Scotland, a gunman killed 16 schoolchildren and 1 adult.
The first thing is that almost all of these mass killings start off with a project for suicide. So these people intend to die amongst their victims. They want to be remembered as powerful, terrible, evil monsters.
Martin Bryant seems to tick most of those boxes.
Martin Bryant had all of that. The final thing about them is they're following a script. What these people want to do is die in a terrible blaze of publicity. They don't want to finish up in prison, in psychiatric hospitals, being exposed as the pathetic failures that they actually are.
Determined that life should go on, Coralie Lever is now a leading member of the Australian Bravery Association, which promotes the recognition of everyday heroes.
It's the best thing I've ever done, and I can help other people, and that's what warms the heart. You can makes you feel good when you can help others, and this is what I want to get across and say there is a life there, but maybe different to what you planned, but there is a life, and it's what you make it.
Incidentally, the world is still a beautiful place.
It is. It certainly is.
Since she's written and spoken out, people might tend to blame her now. Can you attach blame to the parent of someone like Martin Bryant?
Not in the least. You just have to feel sorry for her.
It's irrational, of course, but testament to the maternal bond that a parent can cling to love in the face of such a monstrous truth. Though deeply damaged, Carleen Bryant has somehow found a way to carry a burden that no mother should have to bear.
Well, for many, many years, I was in fear of walking out of my door onto the street, in fear of who would recognise me. I was always looking over my shoulder to see if people would recognise me as being Martin's mother. But since then, people have said, you go out, you hold your head high, you've got nothing to be ashamed of.
A man of limited mental capabilities languishes in Risdon prison without a friend and abandoned by the legal profession. He has never faced a trial and was induced by his defense lawyer to plead guilty after he had continually denied his involvement. His trial and conviction was accomplished in the media. There are so many anomalies surrounding this case that have never been properly dealt with, and the political will to bring these anomalies to a close has been sadly lacking.
What did you know? How much did you know? And when did you know? Why did you lie? Do you ever cry? Look us all in the eye. We went off to fight 'cause we thought it was right. We were trying to do the right thing as the fires of war had been fanned. You had nothing to say as they blew us away. Men were dying. As you tallied the score, boys marched off to a war that was planned. What guided your way? Was it power and pay? Is that all that mattered? As your plans were deployed, many lives were destroyed, and families were shattered. We trusted in you, and the things that you'd do would protect our way of life. How could we know that you served another? And when you saw our pain, you just did it again. Yes, you turned the knife while you smiled in our face and convinced us that you were our brother. nothing to say as they blew us away. Men were dying. As you tallied the score, boys marched off to a war that was planned. And when you saw our pain, you just did it again. Yes, you turned the knife while you smiled in our face and convinced us that you were our brother. There will soon come a day, there's a price you will pay for all your betrayals. You can snicker and smile, at least for a while, but justice prevails. Yes, your life is replete with these days of deceit, but God never fails. 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 God never
Let's have a look at the topic we've got tonight: Port Arthur, deceit, and terrorism. You know, it seems that any alternative viewpoint on Port Arthur is forbidden in Australia by those that would be our masters. You're simply not supposed to talk about it. You're certainly not supposed to hear what's being said. And that's why we get the dissent, that's why we get the censorship, that's why we get an attack on those who would give another viewpoint. Today we've got two speakers speaking on the same topic: Port Arthur, deceit, and terrorism. When Wendy Skerr first heard shots at Port Arthur, she ran towards the Broad Arrow Cafe. She heard something whistle past ahead and stopped and ran into another building, the centre, and phoned the police. She had some difficulty getting across the viewpoints of police that there was trouble at Port Arthur on that tragic Sunday. She was the first staff member to enter the Broad Arrow Cafe, and she's received many commendations for what she did on that day. Now, Wendy's been a Tasmanian all her life, visited the mainland a few times, and we're pleased to have her here tonight. For 20 years, she's been a member of St John Ambulance Brigade. Her role was firstly to teach others about first aid, to also look after the many first aid kits that are on the Port Arthur historical site. And if she wasn't teaching, she was working as a tour guide. And that was what she was doing on that Sunday. Wendy's going to share with us a little of the history of Port Arthur and also the location. And she said this is an important point. And then she's going to tell us what she experienced on that Sunday, her own experiences. Ladies and gentlemen, to welcome our first speaker for the new millennium at the Inverell Forum 2001, let's give a welcome to Wendy Skerr.
I would like to thank the people of Inverell and the Forum Committee for inviting me here tonight to speak. If it hadn't have been for these people, I guess my story would never have been told. Thinking Australians are not fools. They simply don't know the half of it. John Howard said it would be too hurtful for the victims and their families to have a coronial inquiry, as did the Tasmanian Attorney General Ray Groom. We're still waiting for that coronial inquiry. Without finality, how can we be expected to continue our lives? I'm just going to give you a little history and just show you on the map exactly where Port Arthur is. Port Arthur was settled in 1830 and it closed in 1877. And it was once Australia's largest industrial town. They made everything there from ships to nails. There was approximately 12,700 convicts went through there over that period, and many boys. There were many young boys transported from England. I will talk about communication. Communication with the outside world in the 1830s, using a semaphore system, enabled a message to be sent to Hobart Town and a message returned within 15 minutes. If a phone wasn't available on the day of the massacre, I hate to think what would have happened. All other forms of communication with the outside world were hopeless. Two-way radios, mobile phones. They did it better in the convict days. And I'm just going to walk over here and just show you where Port Arthur is, and Andrew will also be using this map. This is Port Arthur, and this is where Seascape was. This is where Turana was. We're talking about this quite a bit. And this is Eagle Hawk Neck, and this is the only way you can get onto the Tasman Peninsula. So you can see why they chose this area as a penal or a prison, because it was surrounded by water, and it would be an island only for this little neck of land, which is only probably 200 metres wide. And then we've got this other peninsula, and this is the Forestier Peninsula. And up here we have a bridge that just, when it's open, completely shuts that off too. So you've got actually the Forestier and the Tasman Peninsula. I would also like to point out the coal mines. I would like you to see where they are in relation to Hobart. Now on Mount Wellington in Hobart, there is a tower that actually transmits all the communications. And the coal mines out here would have been the only place where the perpetrators of this massacre would have planned to leave a heroin haul, as they called it. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the Tasman Peninsula is southeast of Hobart. Travelling time from Hobart is 1.5 hours. That's travelling at the speed limit. The road is not very good. It's rather windy and quite narrow. My day at Port Arthur started on the 28th of April 1996. It is my own story. My life stopped that day. To best describe the feeling, it would be to say it's just like a tattoo on your brain. I feel like taking the top off my head and scrubbing until all my memory is removed. But it won't go. I only think about it every 10 minutes now. For the first 2 years it was all the time. I left the ferry at about 1:10 p.m. When I reached the outside balcony of the cafe, I noticed a young man with blonde hair staring at me. He would have known I was a staff member, as we always wore a navy uniform with a tag, a name tag. As I walked by, I nodded at him, he nodded back, and I went into the cafe to buy lunch. I went to where the staff could purchase their lunch without getting hurled up, and walked out of the side door, and I went to the information centre. It was then about 1:20 p.m. Okay, this is the Broad Arrow Cafe, and there's a lot of bush up behind these cars. It's important you remember that. I'll just walk across here now. The side door of the cafe was about here. That's where I was. So that was called the information centre. Along here there is a little gap where some people could have got out of the building and escaped, but that's to come a little bit later. Down here, the bodies are still there. The couple here, another one here. That was the next day. I went to the toilet, as all good guides used to do, and returned to the information office and sat down for lunch. Often I did eat in the Broad Arrow, but that day, fortunately for me, it was busy. We had about 500 people there, and so I didn't sit down in there and have lunch. The shooting itself started at about 1:30. I say about because the 1:30 walking tour hadn't gone. If the guides didn't leave on time, they'd find they have no time to have 5-minute break when they came back before they'd have to take the next one. So the walking tours always went on time, and it hadn't gone, they hadn't even split the group up, so it was definitely before 1:30. And that is often disputed. I heard the sound of very, very loud bangs, and I never thought of a gun. I thought of it as possibly a gas explosion or anything but. I ran towards the cafe, and I was about 6 inches in from the side of this, you might be able to do that from this point where I was, sorry. About 6 feet from the side of the cafe, and I felt something fly by my head. Had no idea it was a bullet. Still wasn't thinking, actually. I thought I was having a brawl in there. I thought, well, I'm not going in there, lucky for me. And then a person came down the steps to the front of the Broad Arrow, and he wasn't touching the steps. He was going over them. He was flying. And he was warning us to run. Well, out in front of the information centre, we had about 70 people waiting to go on this tour. There was a bus load of elderly Americans, and they sort of didn't want to leave. They thought, gee, they do it well down here, you know. They really put on a show down here. In fact, I've lost sound. No, a little bit early in a little bit earlier in the day, one of the tours had been going up to the Commandant's cottage, and just as the shooting started, there was a girl taking a tour away from there, and that's over the bay from the Broad Arrow, right opposite. And when the shooter started to fire shots across their way, she went down on the ground, flat out on the tummy, with the Navy uniform on, and the American said, gee, they can't do that well. And it wasn't. So I got the warning to run, and I just froze. And he said that the people were being shot, so I just froze to the spot. And I don't know how long I stood there, actually. Might have been a minute. But I thought, well, I've got to get in there, but I can't go in there yet. So I ran away towards where they were trying to shift the elderly tourists. And then I thought, God, if we don't let the police know, we're all going to be butchered. So I went back into the information centre, and you all can see where that is. And when I got in there, Sue Burgess and Stephen Howard were in there, and they weren't phoning the police, but what they were doing was very good. They were phoning around the display houses and up to the toll booth and warning them to not let any more cars in, to get the people in the area and get as many people locked up in those houses as they could. And so I ran in and I rang the police. It was 1:32 p.m. exactly, and that has been recorded. I had a little trouble convincing the police officer, naturally. He wouldn't be able to believe what I was telling him, not at Port Arthur. But in the end he said, be careful, so I knew he believed me. I'd decided where I was going, the other two hadn't. So I just said, follow me, I know where to go. And then Sue, being Sue, who was always very conscientious, she said, what about the money? Well, I used the F word, the money. One of them had grabbed a two-way radio, I hadn't thought of that, and so we ran. And just as we came out of the cafe, he came onto the balcony of the Broad Arrow and he started firing shots. I've been told that he actually was firing at us, but he mustn't have been trying to kill us. I think he was just going over our heads. But the man that saved us was a gentleman at the penitentiary on a cherry picker, and he had it right up in the air, working on the brickwork. Anyway, he decided he'd better get out of there, and he started the motor up. And then he started having a go at him as he lowered it down. So we got around the toilets, and up behind the Broad Arrow there's a lot of bush, and there's a bit of clear space. So we ran up the hill, and when we couldn't hear him shooting, we dived into the bush. Then we'd run again when he was shooting, because we could tell where he actually was, and when he wasn't shooting, we jumped in the bush again and laid flat. We did this 3 or 4 times, and then we heard shooting up the road. That would have been, the first shots would have been when he killed the Mikax. Then it seemed to be getting further and further away. And then we got up behind the cafe, and we found a young lady who was working in the cafe, and she was just so traumatised and frightened. She was just standing there. As we walked down the hill to go into the cafe, we took the young girl with us, and I knew we wouldn't be able to take her in there, but we found a man that appeared to us to be shot with a shotgun. He seemed to have pellets all over him, but I've been told since it wasn't a shotgun. I don't know. Finally, another man who'd been shot in the head, and he had a piece of dirty rag over it. He said, do you want to have a look at it? I said, no, leave the rag there. He said, I don't know whether the bullet's gone through my brain or whether I just, creased the skull. So that was nothing to what I was to find later. So we got these two men and got the young girl and got her to hide them. Now, about this time, we got a message from Ian Kingston, one of the car parkers on the day, and he said, the vehicle's abandoned, it's still here, but we don't know where he is. So I was frightened, and I think that was the stage I peed myself. I was panicking, I was so frightened. I also knew what I was going to have to face in the Broad Arrow, and having been on an ambulance for years, I've seen what guns can do. So I told the girl from the Broad Arrow to take them in and hide them. Get with them and take them further into the bush and hide them. I said, we know where you are. We'll know. Someone will come and get you. Just stay there. Sue and I climbed down the hill to the back of the cafe, and Stephen joined us. Then Sue said to me, I wonder if the girls got out. And I said, what girls? They said, Nicole and Liz. I said, oh God, no. Are they at work? And she said, yes. Now, Nicole and Liz were, Nicole was Stephen's wife. Nicole was Sue's daughter, and Liz was Stephen's wife. They'd been married at Port Arthur only 3 years before. Nicole was 17, Liz was 25, and she'd only worked at Port Arthur for 2 weeks. And I'm thinking to myself, how do I cope with this if there's anything wrong? So Andrew, I think, put an OHP up in the cafe. I took some very deep breaths and I entered the cafe. Had to put on a brave front. There were bodies and body parts everywhere, even on the ceiling, sliding down the walls, blood and bodies everywhere, the smell of warm blood. I knew I had to look for the girls. I had to go to the gift shop area, and both these girls were lying behind the counter of the gift shop, and both were dead. I thought, how am I going to cope for this? So, I knew as soon as I looked at them they were gone, because there was a huge blood loss. And so I put on an act and I got down and made out I was feeling for their pulses because they were saying, can you do anything? And I just didn't know what to say. I knew they were dead and I just didn't know what to say. I just said, they're both dead. I'm so sorry. There was silence for a couple of minutes. I couldn't look at Sue and Stephen. I just couldn't look. I just couldn't look at their faces. They were so brave in a terrible position. I asked them to leave and go out and help the others. They both did. Actually, Sue was in charge on the day. They put on a brave face and nobody out there would have known what a terrible fate their girls had suffered. They continued to look after the visitors as they steadily returned to the front of the information centre. Both Sue and Stephen were highly trained in first aid because I'd trained them. This is what I had trained for myself, but never at this magnitude. When you join the emergency services, you don't expect it to be easy. I'd experienced many tragedies, but never a war zone like this. No one could be trained for this. I started to look for survivors in there, and there was only 3 left alive. The 2 men I'd found on the hill outside they'd got out, but that's actually where they were shot. I'll talk about the first person I found alive. His name was Graham Collier. He was shot in the neck. He was choking on his own blood. He was on his side. I could do nothing for him. A man's voice said, his mouth is so full of blood. I said, just put your fingers in his mouth and scoop it out. This was Dennis Gabbety, a Victorian policeman. He sat with Graham while I searched for more casualties. I found out much later that Lynn, a nurse from Victoria, and you've probably read about Lynn, had gone into the cafe before me and she'd put Graham in the side position and had actually sucked the blood from his airway with a drinking straw. Graham had his neck artery, or his carotid artery, partly clipped. He stayed conscious and he found out that if he was able to kink his neck in a certain way, it slowed the bleeding. The bullet also grazed his cervical spine, and that's this area. The first one's down the back of your neck. And because it grazed his spine, it did something to the spinal cord, so he suffered quite a bit of paralysis even at that time. I had been trained in triage, and I knew that I had to limit the time that I could spend with Graham because I was going to lose other people, and I'd actually triaged him out of it. I'd left him to die, and I've got to live with that. But he didn't die. He lived. Graham was able to watch the gunman as he killed and wounded several people. Just before the gunman left the cafe, he was playing dead while the gunman stepped over and around him. Graham did survive that day. His life since has been similar to all of us mentally, but he suffers a lot of pain. Carolyn Lawton, she's the one that's in the new idea this week. She was travelling with Graham and her 15-year-old daughter Sarah. She was starting to make a lot of noise. She was absolutely petrified and she would have been in agony. She was shot from the front, about here, and the bullet went straight through and put a 5 centimetre hole in the shoulder blade. It just went straight out. I asked her to be quiet because she kept screaming, and I was so frightened. I said, he's going to come back in. If he knows you've left anyone alive, he's going to come back in. So I was petrified. We still didn't know if he'd be back or not. And once again, very firmly, I had to say, be very quiet. She said, have you seen Sarah? Sarah was a 15-year-old daughter. She said she's got a black hat on. And only a few feet away I had saw Sarah. She was killed instantly and with a terrible head wound. I couldn't tell Caroline the truth. Sarah was only 15 years old, and I think if I'd have told her then, Caroline wouldn't have lived. In fact, I wish now I probably had her because I don't think she wants to live. A man came with some tea towels and helped me try to stem Caroline's bleeding and to keep her calmer down. I then went to look for more